Okay, so it's 5 after, and I'm going to let people sort of stroll in, but I wanted to leave time, or we both wanted to leave time for Q&A. So I think we're going to try and get started, and we'll let questions fill in what people missed at the beginning. So hi, I'm Colin Dixon. I'm the chair of the Technical Steering Committee in OpenDaylight. I'm also a principal software engineer at Brocade, and Devin's a senior staff software engineer at Brocade, which is a too long title, but it basically means that Devin knows what actually goes on, whereas I don't. And so we're going to talk to you today about basically best practices and pitfalls for building products out of OpenDaylight. And the agenda is something like this, where I'll tell you a little bit about what it is. I'll give you a brief introduction. Then we're going to talk about common pitfalls, which is basically what can you try to avoid doing. Then we're going to try and tell you, OK, what should you do instead of that? And then we're going to talk about future considerations, which is ways that we can evolve OpenDaylight to try and make it better at being productized. Since it's sort of an explicit goal of OpenDaylight, it does a pretty good job of it so far, but there's places where it's definitely not quite there. And then we'll take questions, and hopefully it will be really interactive at that point. And hopefully this won't be too long of a presentation part. So I just want to start off with a little bit of background on sort of who we are and why you might want to listen to us. Brocade, I think, released the first sort of public OpenDaylight-based controller that you could actually go buy. And so far, we've shipped it based on Helium SR1, SR2, and SR3. And we're in the process of shipping it based on SR4, which hasn't quite come out yet, and Lithium, which just released. It's running in production with real customers. And we've sort of shipped updates, including patches on top of it. And we've been pretty successful in doing this, even when incorporating upstream changes back down into the product, and basically also trying to get things which we needed for the product or to enhancements to OpenDaylight upstream, and making sure they go upstream first, and trying to avoid ending up in a situation where we actually have different parts of OpenDaylight down than we have up. And we'll get into that. And so really that's why you might think that we know what we're doing. And we're going to share really our experiences. And this is what our recommendations for best practices are. I'm not telling you have to do it this way. What I'm telling you is that I, and to a larger extent Devin, have many, many, many scars from trying to do this. And this is what we would have done if we had known that in advance. So with that, I'm going to launch into sort of what it is that you shouldn't do. OK. This is basically how everybody starts off working with OpenDaylight. And I know because I've done this at 2 different companies now, which is that you go clone the public code. It's all public. It's all in a Git repo. You go git clone. You have all the code. You basically look at it and say, cool, this code does almost what I wanted to do. I just need to augment it in a few places and add a couple of extra features. So you go and you make those changes in the code, in the repository that you've cloned. You run the build. You test it, and you ship it, and you sell it. And it's all fantastic. And great, that was really, really easy. And so this is basically the first thing everybody does. And it looks something like this, which is, the orange stuff is OpenDaylight. The green stuff is my code. I downloaded OpenDaylight. It was all orange. It turned out that I needed to modify the host tracking stuff a little bit in order to make my stuff work. I had to write a Fabric application. And so I modified the host tracking application. And I made the Fabric application. And sort of I have a bunch of OpenDaylight code and a little bit of my code sort of all intermingled with each other. And what you've done is you've really set yourself up in a really, really terrible position, despite the fact that this is what nearly everybody does. So the high order bit is that by cloning the code, by merely cloning the code, you've essentially forked it. You now have changes in your Git repository which are not upstream, which means that your changes may or may not be accepted upstream, even if you want them to be. And you have to handle the fact that now any patch which comes into the upstream of OpenDaylight, you have no idea whether or not it's going to nicely fit with the changes you've made. You have no idea whether the changes you've made are going to nicely fit with. You have no idea if the changes that you've made are going to continue to be reasonably supported upstream. So you might actually have to re-implement all of the changes that you've made. And you basically end up in this merge conflict hell. Where it is that every morning you wake up and you do a git pull and you discover that you have 17 conflicts and you spend 3 hours trying to resolve them. And then in order to deal with that, you do this less often. You don't do it every morning. You do it on Monday morning, or you do it on the first of the month. And the result is it gets even worse because you're doing it less often, so you do it even less often. And the result is that you end up with lower interaction with the community because your code base is out of sync. And so when you have a bug, you don't know whether the bug is in your code or upstream. And you don't get the security pitch that patches as fast. And at the end of the day, really what actually happens is you stop interacting with the community entirely, you drop out, and you vanish. Because you just can't sustain this. And I have witnessed this happen, and I have yet to see somebody recover from this nosedive once you get far enough down it. It just doesn't happen. There's also this other note, which, and I'm not a lawyer, and this is not legal advice. Devin is not a lawyer, and it is not legal advice. But the OpenDaylight source code is all licensed under the Eclipse public license. The Eclipse public license has what's called weak copy left, which is to say that you can be compelled under certain circumstances to release modifications you make to upstream code if you ship it as part of a product. So by doing this, you might actually be exposing yourself to giving away your IP and giving away your source code, in addition to the fact that it's just technically the wrong thing to do. And so basically, if you take nothing away from this talk, it's that the absolute simplest, most obvious thing of download the code, modify it, and then ship it, in practice is forking and will result in permanent divergence from upstream OpenDaylight, which is to say that you will no longer have an OpenDaylight-based product in most of the ways that you or your customers care about. So don't. And so I've sort of lived that. When I came to Brocade, you can ask Devin, I basically jumped up and down and screamed and said, do not do this, do not do this, do not do this. And we've mostly managed to avoid doing it, and I think we found some pretty good best practices. But Devin has lived that for the last year. And so I'm going to hand it off to Devin to talk through exactly the best practices that we think, what we do internally and what we think would be best for people that actually want to ship product based on OpenDaylight.
Yeah, so I was actually going to say, Colin came in screaming, jumping up and down, don't do this, don't do this. We did it anyways. Thankfully, after about a month, we sort of realized our mistake, and we were compiling OpenDaylight. It was taking 2.5 hours to compile everything and compile all the projects, and we're like, do we really want to go down that? And we sort of said, no, we don't want to go down the road of treating OpenDaylight as sort of our own code and everything. We actually want to treat that OpenDaylight as a third party. In the same way that you don't go out and sort of recompile Java core, recompile the array list class, or make modifications to it, you don't want to be doing the same thing to OpenDaylight. If you treat OpenDaylight as a third party, you would reference their artifacts. We have the whole Maven architecture and the Maven build process to basically make it easy to get third-party dependencies. All of the OpenDaylight artifacts are hosted on a Maven repository, and you just specify your own POM file. You say, I depend on OpenDaylight. It'll download the artifacts for you, and that's it. You're not compiling anything, so you're faster builds. You're not risking exposing your code because you're not modifying OpenDaylight code in any way. It's all just pulling things in and referencing them. There are scenarios where you may want to treat OpenDaylight as a third party, or maybe you don't want to treat OpenDaylight as a third party because you actually want to make changes to the third party code or to the OpenDaylight code. If you need to modify OpenDaylight code, it's good to get into the habit of saying, all the stuff I'm doing to change OpenDaylight needs to go upstream. It's not to say everything you do needs to go upstream, but when you're changing sort of core code, you're doing a bug fix, you're trying to tweak an API, you want to upstream that. You want to get that exposed to the community, get it reviewed and accepted by the community as quickly as you can, and then pull those changes back in for all the reasons that Colin pointed out. You don't want to go in and start using something internally and then try and push it up, and 3 months later find out that the community doesn't want it that way, and they're going to change the API. Because now all of a sudden, you have to make the decision, do you use your internal version and not change anything but fork? Or do you now have to change your code to sort of whatever the community accepts? And again, I think we get into this a little bit later on, but you want to look at using APIs and then potentially hiding proprietary implementation behind that if you want. There are cases about critical bug fixes and patches where you may need to go get them out a little bit faster than the community is going to produce that stuff. And there's nothing to say that you can't push, pull in a change, cherry pick it to a repo or something, and then build your own version or rebuild a version of an OpenDaylight artifact. There are a few key points here, though, is anytime you're making a change, get it upstream. Get the code changes upstream and then cherry pick that change back to yours. That way, A, you know that there's an OpenDaylight patch or a Garrett out there that can be reviewed and merged into a stable branch pretty soon. And if that gets accepted and merged in, well, now you know the community accepts your patch and you have much lower risk to then bring it back in and rebuild the code yourself. Do you see this note down here? I'll call that out as well. This is complex. It is risky. You need to make sure that when you're rebuilding things, you rebuild things with the correct version dependencies, and you rebuild the correct jars, and the jars all play with each other nicely. Which is why, if you can, it's easier to generally wait for upstream to incorporate those changes. But always start in the community with any patches that you do. Start in the community. Bring them back down locally if there is a critical patch that you need to get out there.
And just to be clear on this slide, so the top half of the slide is saying, get the patch upstream, and then, am I mic'd?
Yes.
Okay, I can't hear it. And then, and they get the patch upstream, and then wait for it to come out, and Lithium SR1. And basically, when Lithium SR1 ships, you will internally bump your product to say, I depend on Lithium SR1 artifacts now, and I'll get it. As opposed to the bottom one is saying, I might need a patch before Lithium SR1 because I have a customer that needs a security vulnerability patched, or they need a bug fix immediately. And there's always, with enough money, it's always worth taking on the complexity and risk, but understand sort of what the trade-offs are and what you're willing to tolerate. So that's sort of the difference between the top and the bottom. You can do the bottom. Doing it well involves a lot of tooling and a lot of care, but it can be done.
And again, if you start upstream, you have a much better chance of it being incorporated into the environment when you need it. So I sort of said all this, but we'll say it again because it really is important to emphasize this. You do want to participate in the community, and I know Colin will go off here in a second as I get through this slide, but you should work on, if there's bug fixes in the core OpenDaylight code that you want, again, we're not lawyers, but that stuff's under EPL. You have to make sure that you're dealing with those licenses correctly if you're changing code and fixing code and shipping it. Generally, it's just easier to say, hey, this isn't fundamental. It's not going to be the differentiator between my company or somebody else. We might as well get that into the community, get that into the upstream code. Everybody's going to benefit from it. It'll make OpenDaylight look better, which will make your product based on OpenDaylight look better. So you should, as you can, provide bug fixes, discuss new requirements. Make sure you're in there talking about API changes that need to happen, and talking about implementations if you're willing about the what implementations you're doing or how you're doing them, or what requirements you may have, or what types of general things you want to do. And generally speaking, you're going to get patches faster. You'll get fixes faster. Other people may say, oh, yeah, I had the same problem. We were going to fix it this way, and now you don't have to do any work. So the sooner you engage the community, the sooner you'll get fixes back and sort of input and so forth. Now I'll let Colin, because he does it so well, I'll let Colin sort of go off on what this slide is not trying to be.
So there's, anyway, I'll add two things. One of them is that as you engage with the community, you'll find that you actually, by virtue of upstreaming patches, your reputation will improve in the community. Also, your engagement with the community will improve, which means that when you go and you actually have things that, design decisions that you'd like to make, people will listen to you more, and you'll have more idea of what's coming down the pipe. You will get blindsided by things at 2:30 in the afternoon on a Thursday much less often if you're in this process, because you're seeing the code as it's shipping. But the last thing which I want to add, and Devin likes this because, when you talk to people, when I first got involved in open source, everybody was like, are you going to go and move out onto a hippie commune and sing campfire songs, dancing around, having fun? And there is a kumbaya happy part of why you should ship your code upstream, it feels good. But and you should do it for that reason if it makes you happy, and it certainly does enter into why it is that I do that way. But just from a strictly business product engineering perspective, from a technical engineers, thing, this makes sense. You don't need the kumbaya stuff. It's happy, it makes you feel good, great, but it is not, your product managers and your, salespeople and your managers we should be making the same decision regardless of happy feelings that you might get. And actually, Dave Neary, there's at the bottom of this thing, has a whole bunch of slides on swimming upstream. These slides are online somewhere. I know because people have said the slides look good before we give the presentation, so they've found them. They're somewhere on the OpenDaylight website. I'll also post them to my website. But you can go read that talk. That's a whole 60-slide presentation on why it is that this is the right thing to do. So that way we don't have to spend 60 slides on the same thing. You can go read those, and they're fantastic. And Dave Neary is around, too, if you see him. He's a lot of fun.
I'll just add one other piece of this is more from the reality side of it is, that's all nice and fancy and everything, but I don't really care about that. The real impact to me, I'm involved with most all the fixes where we want to pull back a change from the community, and every time someone's like, oh, we got to patch OpenDaylight, I'm like, great, get an upstream bug first and get the commit upstream, and then we'll talk about pulling it back, because I don't want to have to pull back the same code twice. That's wasting my time, it's wasting our CI resources, it's wasting the ability to build a product. And so that's my really selfish motivation to say, yeah, don't even talk to me about pulling something into our code until you've patched it upstream, and then we can talk. So some other big things going forward, and we've said all this stuff about treat OpenDaylight as third party. Well, that's great, but what if you need to use or change out functionality in OpenDaylight? And this is where it may seem obvious, but you want to consider and try and use OpenDaylight's modularity to your advantage. So again, you're treating OpenDaylight as this big bundle of functionality, and we have all these different ways to modularize or separate out functionality. We have OSGI, we have the Carafe container, we have Maven to make the build process easier, and then we also have YuLing and MD-Sal that a lot of investment has gone into in the config subsystem to make it really, really flexible. So you have this great, really flexible core, and it's there for the sole purpose of allowing you to separate your applications out from the existing OpenDaylight stuff and have it be more of plug and play instead of I'm going to modify what's there because I need to just tweak it slightly. It's harder, it takes more discipline, but it's the only way you can move forward and stay up to date with OpenDaylight. And again, there's this note, we're not lawyers, et cetera, et cetera. OSGI is generally friendly around the EPL license. It was designed with that in mind. So generally, the boundary of a bundle is nice and plays pretty safely with EPL. Talk to your lawyers when you are getting ready to release, though. All right, so here's a very quick example. So we talked about that Fabric app that Colin was talking about in that first slide, and the very easy thing is I need to tweak host tracker a little bit to do something different. Well, so the easy thing was just modify host tracker. But really what you want to do is leverage the modularity. So there's all these great different APIs and interfaces that have been built into the product, and they seem painful. It's like, why are you making me create all these interfaces for things where we only have one implementation? And the reason is so that you can do things like this, where you can say, I need to change the way host tracker works. There's an API that's well-defined that tells me what it needs to support. So I can actually write my own implementation of host tracker that adds in my additional functionality I need for my app. And then the other Fabric apps can just sit on top of that. And using the modularity of OpenDaylight and YuLing and the config subsystem and MD-Sal, we can just swap that out, and nobody else will be any the wiser about it. The other thing that you can consider leveraging, and this I think is a little bit less mature in OpenDaylight today, is the idea of leveraging the extensibility of the YuLing models, or the augmentation of YuLing models, which allows you to add in additional functionalities to points within a YuLing model and somehow extend that capability to handle proprietary extensions. And I think the best example of this is OpenFlow, where you actually have the ability to put in vendor extensions to the OpenFlow protocol and handle them in custom Java code or vendor extension Java code to handle those extensions. This is an area I know we'll talk about it that needs to mature a little bit in OpenDaylight, but we'll get to that in future considerations in a little bit. Anything else am I missing on this one? I think we're good. So the next thing, this next item here may seem a little extreme. It's one thing that I'm getting passionate about because I spend so much time on looking at CI, I mean, every day the first thing I do is I log in, I look at our Jenkins server, I see how our builds are doing, and look at what's failing, if anything. And I've personally come to the environment that I really hate snapshots in terms of development. And because you're treating OpenDaylight as a third party, it should be treated as a third party. I mean, for the most part, you're not compiling against beta versions of Java or alpha versions of Apache libraries or something. You're waiting until they actually release the thing, and then you compile against it. And the reasons why you do that is you don't want sort of volatility. You don't want to be changing 2 variables every time you build, because then if a problem is introduced, you don't know where the problem came from, right? Is it something in the upstream code that changed, or is it something in my code that changed? You want to only change one variable at a time so that it's easier to isolate the problems. So this may seem drastic, but it's to really make the point that when you build against an OpenDaylight snapshot, not only are you building your code, you're sort of taking in the risk of the upstream snapshot code, because those are development versions. They may introduce bugs, they may introduce changes to the APIs that break the way your code will work. So in general, snapshots are volatile. They change constantly. Maven, I think, is every 24 hours they pull down a new snapshot version if one's created, sort of by default. It's hard to determine where your failures are in the code. And if you are planning on releasing your product, you're not going to be able to release them with snapshot versions, at least if customers know, I suppose. Customers want stable artifacts. They don't want development versions. You don't want to actually release development versions, because then what happens if that development version changes the API because it's still under development, and now you're sort of have this release out there with this half-baked API or this half-baked implementation. It's changed completely before it actually released. You're just setting yourself up for a world of hurt. So by depending on released artifacts, it allows you to release or shift your release multiple versions of your proprietary app. If say a service release is taking too long, you can go out with 2 minor releases of your app and then go out with the one that goes to the next version. It's not to say you don't want to build against snapshots, but that should be that shouldn't be your only path to success. If you have time and the resources, it is worthwhile to go in and look at and say, well, what if I start building against a snapshot of Lithium right now? Because we know it's coming out in a month. I want to see what's changed. I want to see how bad my product's going to break. You can do it. It just means you need to be very disciplined about understanding, is a change in my code or is a change in the upstream code? And you can spend a lot of time trying to debug those types of issues. So I would encourage anybody that's trying to actually actively develop or build against an OpenDaylight or create a product out of OpenDaylight to build against release artifact versions as your primary sort of goal. Once you've got that down, then see how you can roll in snapshots. But you have to be very careful with it. Otherwise, you're just going to spend a lot of time trying to figure out what's going on. Just to illustrate the point that I made, I mean, this is generally how we do our process, where we're writing our application against the release version of Helium. So for example, at time 1, Helium's been released. Helium 1, SR1 is under development. We're not building against Helium SR1. We're building against Helium. We wait until Helium SR1 is finally released. Then we update our product, and we release it based on that. If the API changes are minimal and the changes, functionality are minimal, you can turn that around pretty quickly. I mean, we could turn it around in a day if the API changes were minimal and there's no bugs found during automation testing. So it can still be a fast process, a fast turnaround if you're sort of understanding what you're pulling in as third-party artifacts. And the biggest advantage of this is, let's say in your application, in my company's artifacts, we find a bug. Well, we're not waiting for Helium SR4 to come out before we fix that. We just do another patch against Helium SR2, and great, we're good, right? So that advantage of being able to release your artifacts even faster than OpenDaylight is actually a huge advantage. And you don't want to get tied to OpenDaylight's releases unless you really need some functionality that they're introducing. So that was a lot of information dumped at you at once. The main takeaways, you want to reference OpenDaylight artifacts. The result of following all these steps is you're treating OpenDaylight as a third party. From an internal aspect anyways. Generally speaking, your code's isolated. You have fewer risks around having to upstream your code or expose it, fewer licensing concerns. Again, make sure you talk to your lawyers. And when you change versions of OpenDaylight code, if you leverage Maven correctly, you're just tweaking a POM file. You're just saying, I want this version of the jar, not this version. And if the APIs stay the same, all the change is just your pom.xml. And this allows you to sort of have a stable platform on which you're building your new versions of your applications. So one thing that I didn't put in the slides, and I should have, is I am pretty sure, when we started the Brocade controller, it was one POM file that just built the distribution of OpenDaylight. It just pulled in the OpenDaylight artifacts as third-party resources and set up our sort of carafe implementation, and that's it. So you should be able to have a project that is really more or less one bundle, one Maven project, one POM file that pulls in your resources, pulls in OpenDaylight as a third-party resource, and create a distribution from that. And then from there, the world's your playground. You can do what you want with it. But now you're just, again, focusing on this very isolated environment. So that was sort of what we learned. I mean, we went through all the pains that Colin talked about. This is what we sort of gleaned from it, the important things that you need to take away to sort of make your life easier when you're building a product. If you don't trust me, just try it yourself. Try these steps and see how easy it is to sort of build. I mean, all of a sudden, things aren't breaking all the time, and you feel a little bit more comfortable about it, and you gain more satisfaction and sort of confidence in the product that you're building on top of OpenDaylight.
And like most important things, it's harder in the short run, but it is the only way that I've found that causes you to not hate yourself for the rest of your life in the long run. And so it requires a little bit of discipline, a little bit of understanding, a little bit of appreciation of the risks and implications of doing it the wrong way, and trying to actually put the time in. But having been at a bunch of places that have done it the wrong way, like you can't. It will kill you.
Yeah, it'll just be a waste of resources in the long run. So. In fact, it would almost be better if you don't actively develop in OpenDaylight, because then you don't even have the tendency to pull down the code and compile it. You're treating it as a third party. So just the next couple of slides here are sort of, we're looking forward now. I mean, we've released based on Helium. We're looking at Lithium. We're releasing based on Lithium. We've seen a lot of change between the two, a lot of great changes and a lot of issues that we can see are going to be a problem going forward. And Colin's going to sort of cover those few, and then we'll have some time for questions.
Yeah, and I'm going to try and leave as much time for questions as I can. So this is really just things OpenDaylight could do better to be even more of a product platform. And I think that it's always OpenDaylight has always had the goal of being both a product platform and a thing in and of itself. But anyway, the first thing is like we could use to focus more on our users. And this diagram is not really, the checkboxes are like sort of how much each different user cares about each different part of OpenDaylight, whether it's the user interface, the REST API, the apps, and the business logic. But really, this thing up here is not really the point. The point is like, we haven't done a very good job of enumerating who our users are, what components of OpenDaylight they care about and why, and what we could do better to meet their needs. This is something which we need to improve sort of across the board. And I think this has come up. The user advisory group is finally getting spun up in a way that matters, and that's giving us sort of high-level feedback. But even at a low level, we haven't done a fantastic job of this. And a really good example would be like easy upgrades for users. I think if you ask people, every user would tell you the ability to upgrade from Helium to Lithium would be a really, really important thing. And despite that, we still haven't had the time to go through and figure out how to do an upgrade from Helium to Lithium short of install, take the old one down, bring the new one up, and hopefully some of the models will be correct, and migrating data. It's sort of a at your own risk at the moment. And there's a lot of good ideas floating around about how to do it, but there just isn't anything concrete. And so this is sort of a clear requirement, but it's not something we thought about or tested. And there's some particular technical details about how we might go do it at the bottom. But this is sort of an example where it is that I think if we had had a user focus, this might have been baked in earlier, and our lives would have been a lot easier. And I think this is the kind of thing where when you end up having to solve these user-facing problems outside of OpenDaylight in products as opposed to inside of OpenDaylight with tools, you end up with essentially splitting up of the market and all sorts of other things which are sort of not so great. So figuring out these user problems and trying to get them solved in some ways upstream is going to be important. We also have this, another really good example is sort of minimizing risks of updates. Right now, everything is one giant monolithic release. And everything needs to stay in that one giant monolithic release because of how our release processes work. And the result is that, like, if we find a vulnerability in OpenFlow, we patch OpenFlow, and we can't just ship OpenFlow. We have to rebuild everything, every single project in all of OpenDaylight, and then put that together, including the patched OpenFlow and all the other patches that happen to have made to other projects, and test it all. And this, it is really, really scary from the perspective of shipping product to your customers, because what you've said is they want a fix for a vulnerability in OpenFlow, and what you've delivered them is a fix to OpenFlow and some unknown amount of other stuff. And they're not going to, and so the result is they're not going to be willing to deploy that as quickly. And this hurts not only you, but also OpenDaylight in general, because you can't deliver features as fast as you would like to. And so what we'd really like to be able to do is to upgrade only what changed. So fix the OpenFlow vulnerability, patch that, ship a new version of that, and release only that without having to worry about the changes in everything. And this would allow faster delivery of fixes, lower risk to adopting fixes into new features. Now, admittedly, this comes at the cost and complexity of testing, compatibility matrices, avoiding version skew, and all sorts of other nastiness. But this is something we're working on and looking at as we move forward from Beryllium into Lithium. And so these are sort of two places where I think trying to leverage more modularity and trying to have more of the features that you need to build products out of it upstream. And this comes from really sort of focusing on users as opposed to developers. And so I think that's the biggest shift we need to make. So I'm going to leave 15 minutes for questions. But basically, here are the conclusions. And this is, if you remember only 3 things, it's basically 1, treat OpenDaylight as a third party. Don't fork it. 2, leverage Carafe, Maven, OSGI, Yang, and the config subsystem for modularity in order to add your apps and build your things. And then 3, we need to focus on the user to make sort of the next leap in terms of making OpenDaylight both usable as a product in and of itself and also easily turned into products by vendors. And this is where a user is a core developer, an app developer, a REST API developer, operators, administrators, whatever. And good examples of what happens and when you start thinking about this are easy upgrades, modularity, version compatibility, and sort of understanding these things which drop out of when you're thinking about things of a user running it as opposed to a developer writing code. And I think that leaves 15 minutes for questions, and we're happy to take them. So, or you go ahead.
Well, I saw a name, someone, yep, go ahead.
So I guess Phil is in the back of the room, and he give a really good answer to this. But I'll give the version which is my understanding. And basically, the answer is the Eclipse Public License weak copy left, which is to say the requirement that you contribute the code back is a subtle but not onerous incentive to avoid forking, which is that and that tends to be better for a community and for open source projects in general. That basically it is an encouragement that if you're going to go make changes, you ought to give them back. And you ought to not go off and do your own thing, even though technically you could, right? I mean, the Eclipse Public License, the only requirement is that you release it again publicly under the Eclipse Public License. And so you could take the whole code, fork it, and go give your own version as long as it's also upstreamed. But because you can't keep it to yourself, the incentive to do that is lower. And in general, my experience has been, and this has been both at IBM and at Brocade and with lots of other companies, that it strikes a reasonable balance between sort of the fork-prone licenses like Apache and the ones that are just absolute anathema to any companies trying to make profits like GPL and LGPL. That's sort of it strikes a nice balance is basically the answer. And my experience has been actually that it's depending on what your lawyers tell you, it's surprisingly easy to play within the bounds of EPL. Which is like, my guess is that if you ask your lawyers, they will tell you that as long as it's a different OSGI bundle, and you didn't copy the code from somewhere else, that's fine. That's why I say my guess is that your lawyers will tell that. So the lawyers that wrote the EPL at IBM were the ones who taught me all of this stuff. So theoretically, they know what they're talking about, but different lawyers will tell you different things. But the result is that that's a pretty weak requirement. So the only requirement the EPL is saying is that if you change an OSGI bundle in OpenDaylight, and you ship a product based on it, you have to make that code available. And so as long as you can put your proprietary extensions in a different OSGI bundle, you're fine. And that's a pretty low bar in terms of keeping yourself safe.
And in many ways, too, it actually encourages better design, better, sort of object-oriented design. You want interfaces separating your implementations, and then you can swap out your implementation.
Yeah, I mean, case in point, like the OpenFlow extensibility has made it possible so that way, like, this has made it's made us design the OpenFlow plugin in a way that can be extended from outside for legal reasons, but the technical advantages of not having to deal with and actually get patches upstreamed and having to understand that code are also advantageous. And so like the modularity, which encourages, actually does tend to help engineering decisions.
There's another question, I think. Good.
It's public knowledge that the Brocade Viata controller is the basis of what AT&T talked about in terms of their bandwidth on demand system. So when they talked this morning about their bandwidth on demand deployment, that is running the Brocade Viata controller. So when they say they're running an OpenDaylight-based controller, it's our controller. So that's the biggest single deployment that I think we have right now, and might also be the biggest single deployment of OpenDaylight. I don't think I'm comfortable discussing that without talking to somebody else. So it's not a modularity problem, and I'll let Devin jump in. So there's lots of modularity. So OSGI, Maven, Yang, and all these things give you lots of modularity to let you basically independently change different things. And so that's really helpful in sort of stitching everything together. We do an amazing job of using that to be able to replace parts. What we've done a really crappy job of it is letting you independently release things and sort of vary only one thing and not everything at once.
Yeah, I mean, I think the best example of this is I would personally love that, for example, OpenFlow plugin is actually not building against Beryllium right now. I would actually rather that the OpenFlow plugin builds against Lithium. Yep. And that would allow the OpenFlow plugin to, for example, improve its services, improve its functionality without bringing in any of the risk of unstable artifacts from the Beryllium development timeframe. And that would be an example where, OpenFlow plugin is really, you could think of it as just like a private app that you're building and you're leveraging the modularity of the MD-style interfaces or the Yang models to tie your functionality in. So I'd say, that's somewhat modularity, but not per se. That's kind of, you're leveraging OSGI to ship sort of Lithium bundles of core or MD-Sal in the Yang system, and then you're shipping your sort of Beryllium versions of the Helium bundles, and you're leveraging the OSGI modularity to tie those two together. So I think in general, modularity is not a problem. It's a good solution to allowing you to just change what needs to be changed and reduce the risk of changing too much at once. Does that answer your question?
Yes. Yeah. I mean. So I think the answer is, when you're first getting up and off the ground, there is no stable version to depend on. So you have this miasma of everything, and sort of in order to get anything off the ground, you sort of all need to progress as one monolithic entity for a while. And once things cool down a little bit, you can start to find where the boundaries are, and then you can start to independently make progress on developing. And so one thing which I was really hoping I would get into the Beryllium release plan but didn't, and I would like to encourage us to do in Beryllium and focus on maybe in Boron, is the idea that basically you simultaneously develop against the previous release and the current release. So right now we're working on Beryllium. It'd be really great if every single project basically built against Lithium and the development version of Beryllium at the same time. And that's sort of all the things, it's basically saying, take all the things we talked about doing in your internal product, but apply it recursively inside of OpenDaylight at the project level. And maybe we'll get so good at this that we'll probably recursively inside of projects down to the individual bundles, but let's take it one step at a time.
Yeah, I mean, the main point is every project in OpenDaylight, you can look at it as if it's a private company's project. You're referencing the other projects via dependencies. You're not rebuilding, like OpenFlow doesn't rebuild MDSal, right? It doesn't rebuild Yang tools. It references them. We're taking all those same best practices and we're just saying, take it one step further now and treat, build against the stable versions because that'll help stabilize your upstream building.
And just to be clear, this is, Colin putting on his engineering hat, not his TSC chair hat. So this is not me saying, this is what we will do. This is me saying, it's a good idea for us to at least think about this and let's play out what it looks like. So there was a question over here that's been around for a while. Do you want to take it?
Yeah, I mean their bundle versioning is definitely fun. So you're talking about sort of bringing in a critical fix back and rebuilding OpenDaylight bundles. You have to take the risk there as you will. And one option is you try and bump the version numbers, but then you're going to conflict with OpenDaylight. So generally speaking, what you're talking about doing is you're rebuilding the SR2 artifact with some extra code changes. That you need to also make sure they're available through EPL and put upstream because you've changed OpenDaylight code. Again, talk to your layers. So, I mean, generally speaking, you can keep the version the same, and as long as that's the version of your jar that gets installed into the Carafe container, there's nothing wrong with it, and you don't have to change anything.
So internally right now, we just ship the code with the same exact version. And so you end up with two different bundles that have the same version but have different SHA-sums, or whatever you want to call it about. And that has risks, which means that you should not do it lightly. And in the longer run, there's sort of security implications, which is if OpenDaylight starts signing our artifacts, you can't forge OpenDaylight's signature. And so you have to basically add your own internal signatures and basically add that to the root of trust of your particular controller. And so your custom versions will not get loaded into somebody else's controller unless they also choose to trust your root of trust. And so that's sort of we haven't gotten there yet because OpenDaylight doesn't sign their bundles yet, but we're coming there, and that's sort of another thing. This is why it's risky. I remember there was this line at the bottom that said, this is, you can do it, but it has risks and complications, and you should think about it and try and avoid it. That's why. The objectively true thing is that the current shipping versions of our controller are based on Deluxe, and the next version of our products don't use Deluxe. They use a homegrown UI. And the details of that are complicated internal decision making, but that's I think different people in Brocade would say that would work. Some people are happy about that decision. Some people would say we should have stuck with the upstream. But we made decisions for the technical and sort of engineering and marketing reasons we had to. And I think that's sort of the advantage is you can take it or you can not take it.
And I mean the main point there is again the modularity actually made that possible, right?
Yeah.
There's the northbound REST API that Deluxe builds against. So
yeah.
Deluxe wasn't integrated into all the code. Deluxe was an app that was built on top of the northbound API, and that modularity made it possible for us to make that decision.
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah, so the UI is intentionally architected. I mean, OpenDaylight has made the technical decision to be extensible at all costs in almost all places. And that has been a relatively minor inconvenience upstream for huge wins downstream for people. And so case in point, Deluxe, which replaced the previous sort of Java thing, the previous Java interface, which was in Hydrogen, sort of was pretty tightly coupled to the underlying services. Deluxe, literally every single call is a REST call to a northbound interface, which is exposed and documented. We're working on that part. So you can also do the same thing. So Deluxe has no advantages over your user interface.
And I mean, Deluxe is building in, I believe, a bunch of extension points as well. So there are ways to expand Deluxe. Again,
yeah.
it was internal debates that basically led us to say, well, we're going to go with our own UI on top.
I mean, case in point, there are like the SFC project has an internal feature, which is a piece of user interface, which gets loaded into Deluxe. And so actually, the Deluxe Git repository doesn't have anything about SFC in it. The SFC project has a little stub of stuff which gets dynamically loaded into Deluxe and actually rendered. And so it is its own extensible user interface platform. And so you can also do that. Those are, again, everything is designed to be extensible.
Make your choice. Do you want to gain all the benefit of the Deluxe environment or not? And that depends, again, on your business use cases and all.
Yeah.
Can you talk just a little bit about using OpenDaylight as standalone product instead of platform? So, for example, best practices for interacting with the REST API. So, when deploy it as is, interact with the REST API, what are some best practices for doing that on top of what you already spoke about, using it as a platform?
I'm not sure I followed.
It seems like a lot of this is almost centric to using OpenDaylight as a platform, but it also can be sort of a product.
So is the question sort of what the implications of this would be for people that are just downloading OpenDaylight without going through a vendor?
What are the best practices for interacting with it in that way rather than as a platform?
I think the answer would be the same, which is that so essentially if you're using it as a standalone product, which is that you're building your own internal tools based on OpenDaylight, it's just a product for you, right? I mean, and it has all of the same implications. You have internal users, your internal users are going to be just as angry with you when you break it as our customers are when we break it. I think the answer is, it's mostly the same lessons, except that you might have the luxury of playing a little bit faster and looser with the rules based on because you understand your internal customers and you have different levers on top of them than you do against external customers who.
And you have again all the same rules. So REST is it's another API, just in a different format. So you have Java interfaces, you have the REST API. All the same rules around designing a good interface applies to both of those. And again, if you're building an app that uses the REST interface, you're tying yourself to that REST interface. So again, you want the REST interface to be stable. You don't want it changing every day. That's a reason to go against stable versions of a release versus snapshots of a development release. So I'd say really all the same rules generally apply to building an app on top versus building an app that's inside.
And that's sort of part of the same thing, which is we said we'd like to see these same rules apply even inside of OpenDaylight itself, which is like I'd like to see OpenFlow plugin treat the core of OpenDaylight like we treat OpenDaylight, because I think that will lead to better modularity, better stability, and less brittleness. And so it's all part of the same thing.
We're out of time.
We can take one more
we can
question.
get one more in.
Just real quick, what's OpenDaylight doing to ensure backwards compatibility?
That's hard. I mean, one of the things we didn't talk about is that we have a huge amount of internal CI for testing our internal applications against lots of different versions of upstream OpenDaylight, and certainly trying to get an application to run against 3 different versions of upstream OpenDaylight when they have differences and aren't quite bug compatible and aren't quite feature compatible is it takes time, effort, developer time, and automation, like everything else.
If you're treating OpenDaylight as a third party, and now you assume that there's no interface changes between SR2 and SR3, for example, which for the most part, the service releases have been bug fixes, maybe some changes, config system, but generally the Java APIs don't change in a non-backwards compatible way. Then you're really talking about swapping one implementation of OpenDaylight, one jar for another jar, but your code stays the same. So if you treat OpenDaylight as a third party, and you then set up your CI infrastructure and everything, it's actually, generally speaking, you just tweak the version of OpenDaylight that you're using, and now you're testing your app against the old version instead of your app against the current version or something like that.
But moving from, say, Helium to Lithium, that's a much more complicated thing. And,
Yeah. So APIs are changing when you're going from Helium to Lithium. New APIs are being introduced. Others are being deprecated. That's, again, same rules apply. If none of the APIs changed or all of the changes were backwards compatible, then yeah, it's just switch the version from Helium to Lithium and you're good.
And that one of the things that we're trying to do, Beryllium introduces the notion of a stable feature, and a stable feature is basically something, It's a privilege. I mean, it's basically a badge of honor that we can give you, which says like people should be able to rely on this. And one of the things we require is that basically APIs not change faster than once every 2 releases. So you have to be backward compatible 1 release with that feature, otherwise it can't be labeled as stable. And this is basically a way to signal to our downstream consumers. And this is when I say our, I mean I'm talking about OpenDaylight, not Brocade. That basically this is something you can kind of count on and expect that it's not going to change all that much. Other things, the project's going to do what the project's going to do, and sort of trying to let downstream consumers understand what's likely to change and what's likely to be relatively stable over time is something which we're trying to work on. And that's going to make backward compatibility easier. Right now, backward compatibility is it's a pain and it's a lot of testing.
We'll be around if
Cool.
there's more questions or anything,
Yeah.
but thank you guys for coming.
To avoid doing it, and I think we found some pretty good best practices. But Devin has lived that for the last year. And so I'm going to hand it off to Devin to talk through exactly the best practices that we think, what we do internally and what we think would be best for people that actually want to ship product based on OpenDaylight.
Yeah, so I was actually going to say, Colin came in screaming, jumping up and down, don't do this, don't do this. We did it anyways. Thankfully, after about a month, we sort of realized our mistake, and we were compiling OpenDaylight. It was taking 2.5 hours to compile everything and compile all the projects, and we're like, do we really want to go down that? And we sort of said, no, we don't want to go down the road of treating OpenDaylight as sort of our own code and everything. We actually want to treat that OpenDaylight as a third party. In the same way that you don't go out and sort of recompile Java core, recompile the array list class, or make modifications to it, you don't want to be doing the same thing to OpenDaylight. If you treat OpenDaylight as a third party, you would reference their artifacts. We have the whole Maven architecture and the Maven build process to basically make it easy to get third-party dependencies. All of the OpenDaylight artifacts are hosted on a Maven repository, and you just specify your own POM file. You say, I depend on OpenDaylight. It'll download the artifacts for you, and that's it. You're not compiling anything, so you're faster builds. You're not risking exposing your code because you're not modifying OpenDaylight code in any way. It's all just pulling things in and referencing them. There are scenarios where you may want to treat OpenDaylight as a third party, or maybe you don't.
OK, so it's 5 after, and I'm going to let people sort of stroll in. But I wanted to leave time, or we both wanted to leave time for Q&A. So I think we're going to try and get started, and we'll let questions fill in what people missed at the beginning. So hi, I'm Colin Dixon. I'm the chair of the technical steering committee in OpenDaylight. I'm also a principal software engineer at Brocade. And Devin's a senior staff software engineer at Brocade, which is a too long title, but it basically means that Devin knows what actually goes on, whereas I don't. And so we're going to talk to you today about basically best practices and pitfalls for building products out of OpenDaylight. And the agenda is something like this, where I'll tell you a little bit about what it is. I'll give you a brief introduction. Then we're going to talk about common pitfalls, which is basically what can you try to avoid doing. Then we're going to try and tell you, OK, what should you do instead of that? And then we're going to talk about future considerations, which is ways that we can evolve OpenDaylight to try and make it better at being productized. Since it's sort of an explicit goal of OpenDaylight, it does a pretty good job of it so far, but there's places where it's definitely not quite there. And then we'll take questions, and hopefully it will be really interactive at that point. And hopefully this won't be too long of a presentation part. So I just want to start off with a little bit of background on sort of who we are and why you might want to listen to us. Brocade, I think, released the first sort of public OpenDaylight-based controller that you could actually go buy. And so far, we've shipped it based on Helium SR1, SR2, and SR3. And we're in the process of shipping it based on SR4, which hasn't quite come out yet, and Lithium, which just released. It's running in production with real customers. And we've sort of shipped updates, including patches on top of it. And we've been pretty successful in doing this, even when incorporating upstream changes back down into the product, and basically also trying to get things which we needed for the product or to enhancements to OpenDaylight upstream, and making sure they go upstream first, and trying to avoid ending up in a situation where we actually have different parts of OpenDaylight down than we have up. And we'll get into that. And so really this is That's why you might think that we know what we're doing. And we're going to share really our experiences. And this is what our recommendations for best practices are. I'm not telling you you have to do it this way. What I'm telling you is that I, and to a larger extent Devin, have many, many, many scars from trying to do this. And this is what we would have done if we had known that in advance. So with that, I'm going to launch into sort of what it is that you shouldn't do. OK. This is basically how everybody starts off working with OpenDaylight. And I know because I've done this at 2 different companies now, which is that you go clone the public code. It's all public. It's all in a Git repo. You go git clone. You have all the code. You basically look at it and say, cool, this code does almost what I wanted to do. I just need to augment it in a few places and add a couple of extra features. So you go and you make those changes in the code, in the repository that you've cloned. You run the build. You test it, and you ship it, and you sell it. And it's all fantastic. And great, that was really, really easy. And so this is basically the first thing everybody does. And it looks something like this, which is, the orange stuff is OpenDaylight. The green stuff is my code. I downloaded OpenDaylight. It was all orange. It turned out that I needed to modify the host tracking stuff a little bit in order to make my stuff work. I had to write a Fabric application. And so I modified the host tracking application. And I made the Fabric application. And sort of I have a bunch of OpenDaylight code and a little bit of my code sort of all intermingled with each other. And what you've done is you've really set yourself up in a really, really terrible position, despite the fact that this is what nearly everybody does. So the high order bit is that by cloning the code, by merely cloning the code, you've essentially forked it. You now have changes in your Git repository which are not upstream, which means that your changes may or may not be accepted upstream, even if you want them to be. And you have to handle the fact that now any patch which comes into the upstream of OpenDaylight, you have no idea whether or not it's going to nicely fit with the changes you've made. You have no idea whether the changes you've made are going to nicely fit with. You have no idea if the changes that you've made are going to continue to be reasonably supported upstream. So you might actually have to re-implement all of the changes which you've made. And you basically end up in this merge conflict hell. Where it is that every morning you wake up and you do a git pull and you discover that you have 17 conflicts and you spend 3 hours trying to resolve them. And then in order to deal with that, you do this less often. You don't do it every morning. You do it on Monday morning, or you do it on the 1st of the month. And the result is it gets even worse because you're doing it less often, so you do it even less often. And the result is that you end up with lower interaction with the community because your code base is out of sync. And so when you have a bug, you don't know whether the bug is in your code or upstream. And you don't get the security patches as fast. And at the end of the day, really what actually happens is you stop interacting with the community entirely, you drop out, and you vanish. Because you just can't sustain this. And I have witnessed this happen, and I have yet to see somebody recover from this nosedive once you get far enough down it. It just doesn't happen. There's also this other note, which, and I'm not a lawyer, and this is not legal advice. Devin is not a lawyer, and it is not legal advice. But the OpenDaylight source code is all licensed under the Eclipse Public License. The Eclipse Public License has what's called weak copyleft, which is to say that you can be compelled under certain circumstances to release modifications you make to upstream code if you ship it as part of a product. So by doing this, you might actually be exposing yourself to giving away your IP and giving away your source code, in addition to the fact that it's just technically the wrong thing to do. And so basically, if you take nothing away from this talk, it's that the absolute simplest, most obvious thing of download the code, modify it, and then ship it, in practice is forking and will result in permanent divergence from upstream OpenDaylight, which is to say that you will no longer have an OpenDaylight-based product in most of the ways that you or your customers care about. So don't. And so I've sort of lived that. When I came to Brocade, you can ask Devin, I basically jumped up and down and screamed and said, do not do this, do not do this, do not do this. And we've mostly managed